thank you for joining us for Cherry Bekaert's 2023 Tax Credits and Incentives two-day virtual conference. My name is Ron Wainwright. I'm a strategic tax partner with Cherry Bekaert in the Tax Credits and Incentives Advisory Group. Our first session today is centered around a strategic analysis of client footprint and supply chain to delivery. This session will be 1 hour, followed by a two-part session after on understanding the Inflation Reduction Act and other energy incentives. Tomorrow, we will have 4 more sessions for you. And if you've not yet registered, click on the link in our chat to update your registration. Each session will be led by a group of professionals, of partners, senior managers, directors, who share tools, tips, and techniques regarding these topics. We hope you're able to join for both days and for all of our sessions. I'd like to introduce my teammates and our first speakers today. My fellow partner, Jason Hodell of Cherry Bekaert, and Jason will give a little bit about his background as he goes through our presentation today. And also my partner, Dan Mitzenmacher, who's a managing director on our digital team. So let's get started. Our agenda today will be about analyzing footprint and supply chain, as well as conducting a comprehensive analysis of the supply chain and identifying areas of opportunities attributable to a number of areas. We also want to ensure that we're leveraging this analysis into insights for effective decision-making on your all's part as you evaluate your supply chain, as well as Cherry Bekaert has consultants in regards to the supply chain attributable to what is really occurring in the market. So this brings us to our first polling question. How did you hear about the webinar? A Cherry Bekaert tax advisor. B, an email from Cherry Bekaert. C, a friend or colleague. D, Cherry Bekaert alumni. And E, a social media post. All right, let's move on. Let's get into analyzing footprint and supply chain. So what is the current situation that really all companies are facing when we think about the supply chain? We know through COVID, there was a disruption, and it is not new that that disruption continues. And it has been consistently impacting historical events, which are creating increasingly complex challenges for business. We've highlighted a number of areas that you probably have faced and you have dealt with in regards to supply chain delays, long cycle times, workforce shortages, excess obsolete inventory, loss of delayed sales, turning into loss of profit, and ultimately increasing tax implications are impacting the supply chain. So today's environment ultimately is highly impacted with a focus on the following key, what we call tipping points, which is due to the pressures from government, markets, and consumers. So we're seeing a shift, obviously, in globalization. And we're also seeing a shift in what is referred to as sustainability, which we'll talk more about in our presentation today. So let's talk about the shift from globalization to regionalization that we're seeing. Next slide. So we know that manufacturers and really all industries are being reshuffled to both lower cost and to improve availability to their end consumers. We know from a globalization perspective that whether it's the China tariffs or the geopolitical tensions or the higher China labor costs that are now impacting what used to be an outsourced to a lower cost provider. And we know that we have volatility in ocean freight cost that really make China and Asia far less attractive from an outsourcing perspective. We also see Mexico and ASEAN nations who have now ramped up across the board all of their manufacturing bases to compete with China. We know that recent ocean port and rail congestion further highlight the ongoing risk of multi-continental global supply chains. And then ultimately, we know that businesses can lower cost and dramatically improve time to market through what we refer to as nearshoring opportunities or onshoring opportunities post-COVID. So when you think about sustainability, next slide, is in fact very strategic. So carbon neutrality and energy consumption, we know are hot topics, and they also require detail in regards to planning. And that demand planning is not simply over a 6-month cycle. It is literally over a 6, 12, 18, 24, 36-month cycle when you think about sustainability. It is a strategic initiative. So we know that public and private market stakeholders, retailers, and governments are ultimately demanding carbon neutrality plans with a sense of urgency. Many businesses ultimately need help measuring and analyzing where they are today and ultimately what their sustainability plan is over the next 12, 24, 36 months. Companies ultimately can benefit from strategic thinking and ideas to help reduce and eliminate carbon output, and we'll talk about some of those today. But as I indicated, it is a detailed multi-year plan, often going over really 5 to 7 years. We know through major pieces of legislation that renewable energy options are there to reduce the carbon footprint and have ultimately quickly improved both energy efficiency and reduce costs to build and offer businesses more options to decarbonize. Ultimately, sustainability can be for a company a very profitable strategic initiative. This brings us to our second polling question. Has your company begun to address carbon neutrality? A, yes. B, no. C, not sure if this impacts our company. So as we talked about in the agenda, we wanted to help you create a comprehensive analysis for your business and some key initiatives. So I'm going to turn it over to my partner, Jason Hodel, who will talk to us about conducting a comprehensive analysis when we talk about supply chain.
Okay, welcome everybody. I'm Jason Hodel. I'm a partner in the industrial and consumer practice here, helping companies just like you understand everything that's going on between legislation, but more importantly, how you can optimize that, looking at your operations, your sustainability plans, and your nearshoring efforts. So let's go ahead. The point of this first slide here, this is a tax credit and incentives conference to help you understand everything that's going on in Ron's world, okay? That's the bottom right of the screen, okay? That's kind of like the answer. But to optimize the answer for your company, one of the key messages we want you to take away in the very first session here is that you have to bring all pieces together. And we're going to break it up into 3 major pieces. The first is fairly obvious, which is just how are you going to change your operational footprint and what costs can you save versus what costs are going to increase. Secondly, Dan's going to talk about digital transformation and some of the tools you can use to report, measure on sustainability practices that will then drive some of your credits and incentives. And then lastly, we're going to talk about sustainability. It's a very hot topic, and a lot of CFOs and CEOs are on the hook right now to come up with their carbon neutral plan, but it's very complex, very difficult. Point is, you got to think about all these things together at once, and that's why we're here to help in order to make sure 2-3 years down the road, you are getting the tax credits that you expected, okay? Go ahead, Dan. So as we dive into this, over the next few minutes, we're going to break it into 3 separate portions. First, we're going to talk about setting up the problem from an operation and financial perspective. Then we'll dig into sustainability. And along the way, Dan's going to talk about tools and dashboards that we help our clients build so they can track and measure this. And then the real punchline here at the end, we're going to walk you through a case study that shows you exactly how an average United States manufacturer can make sustainability profitable. And that's a headline you're really not seeing in the news right now. People think of sustainability a little bit as an afterthought, maybe a cost. We want to show you how it can be profitable for the company. Okay, so that's the setup here. Go ahead. All right, so let's go ahead and do polling question number 3. We just want to understand how much your company has put together a corporate operational strategy to optimize these things. Just getting a sense for where you all are, please. All right, we'll give that a moment and then we'll move on. Okay, thank you, everybody. Okay, so now let's dig in. This is the first section. Let's get into the details here. I'll set it up and then I'll pass it over to Dan. So this first slide here, it's just breaking the problem up into 4 separate pieces, okay? Ron just talked about the first piece, which is as you think about onshoring or nearshoring, of course, you're going to have to understand the cost differential between where you're manufacturing now and where you might go. Site selection is a service we offer here. There are a lot of strategies to optimize this particular piece of the puzzle, whether it's talking to separate states, looking at different nations within North America. There's all sorts of local incentives and tax credits that need to be brought in. It's not just federal, it's state and local as well. We can help with that. At the end of this presentation today, we're going to show you the cost differentials of China versus Mexico or US versus Mexico, so you have some of the facts right in front of you. Second part is as you build a supply chain from factory to customer, there's a whole host of considerations. The most important one to understand is how much inventory you're going to unlock from being stuck on an ocean freighter in a port that's stopped, okay? And now it's on rail or on a truck, and you can get it to your customer in days, not months. It's a big difference, and that's a lot of working capital inventory unlock. The third portion here, well, that's the point of this whole conference, is to help you understand, you know, the over $2 trillion of back-end federal subsidies and tax credits that are there to incent all of us to help save the planet and make sustainability profitable. But that's just the beginning. There's also state pieces, there's local pieces. There's a whole host of considerations here that you're going to learn about over the next 2 days. And then the last piece here is all these things have to come together into the official CFO model. Understanding in the CFO model, all the puts and takes and coming up with something that you're sure it's ROI positive. And then you can tell that story to your outside stakeholders, the capital markets, private equity owners, and the rest. And we're going to walk through that in a case study at the end of today. All right, I'll pass it over to Dan.
All right, thanks, Jason. I'm Dan Mitzenmacher. I'm a managing director at Bekaert in our digital advisory group. So really deal with everything related to process improvements and strategy, systems integration, and data. And really, I think those are the things are at the heart of this discussion around supply chain operations and optimization. Is leveraging processes and systems to make improvements overall. And really, digital and data is the enabler of all those things from both a financial and an operational perspectives. Process improvements, really the heart of that, leveraging data are important to be able to make informed decisions about your operations and improve your business level, whether it be back-end processes like finance and operations or front-end customer experience and go-to-market strategies as well. And really, supply chain is at the heart of that in moving your inventory and increasing productivity and operations and asset utilization and sales effectiveness across the board. So we like to look at and break down business operations and identify opportunities for enhancements and improvements, leveraging your systems, leveraging data and the back end processes, whether it be using new age technologies like advanced analytics and artificial intelligence and IoT, automation, really to improve productivity of your overall supply chain. And how we do this is looking at your processes and identifying areas of optimization opportunities by understanding some of the challenges that you may have in your current processes and understanding that current state, developing a vision towards future state and opportunities for improvements, and how we would leverage digital and technologies in order to enable that. And then finally, developing a roadmap to enable some of those changes overall to help you increase your operational efficiencies, reduce cost, and improve customer service throughout the organization. So looking at business process as a starting point towards any supply chain improvements. Additionally, I mentioned data was really at the heart of that, and really data can be used to leverage to make informed decisions, to drive decision making that is actionable and improve operations. And there's a plethora of industrial or manufacturing based use cases that we can use as a starting point. And this is really just a blueprint and map of some of the potential areas to target and look for areas to drive efficiencies and define your key performance indicators in order to measure and track success, both looking at kind of how you've done in the past, but also proactively looking at the future and predictive analytics for future optimization efforts. So these are some of the typical use cases that we see to leverage technology and data throughout a manufacturing and industrial organization to improve operations and decrease costs. And data is also kind of the heart of driving measurements towards sustainability efforts, which is kind of the next focus area of our discussion in how we will track, report, and measure sustainability in order to really drive some of the tax incentives.
Okay, so Ron set it up well in the very beginning. There's a lot of pressure on shareholders, stakeholders, executives to fix the carbon neutrality problem. So where's that pressure coming from? Here's a few slides just to walk you through it. If you do business with a European company, this is already your reality. The EU has passed legislation that makes carbon disclosures mandatory, and that started earlier this year. And so a lot of folks are scrambling to do carbon accounting and carbon reporting because they work with Europe or they're a European conglomerate, okay? But the point of the next slide, go ahead, Dan, is that for the US, it's coming really, really quickly. The SEC has already put out some proposals. They are not too detailed yet, okay, but they're taking a lot of public comment. The official standards for SEC reporting related to carbon accounting are expected shortly, okay? There's a lot of work being done here, and there's a lot of puts and takes. But if you are a federal contractor or you're part of the supply chain into a federal contractor, one of the key points here is the executive order has already been published. And the very high level goal is we're going to be net zero for the whole supply chain by 2050. but we want to make meaningful progress by the end of this decade. And a big part of that is if you're part of the supply chain, you're going to have mandatory carbon reporting into the federal government very soon. All right. So the point is, this is not really an if, it's really just a when, and that's applying this pressure. And the message from Cherry Bekaert is we're all under this pressure. So as we're figuring out how to be net zero, and we're figuring out how to nearshore, onshore to become more efficient and reduce costs, well, let's think through all the tax credits and incentives and make this as painless as possible for all of us. But that takes a lot of teamwork between a Cherry Bekaert and a client. Okay, go ahead. Here's the reason we're focusing on supply chain in this very first session. You know, whenever you step back from the situation for an average manufacturer, it's a little bit less about what goes on inside the company. And from a net zero perspective, it's much more about where they're buying raw materials from, how far those are being transported, what's being manufactured with those raw materials, and how much energy is that taking, and then how you're getting your products to market. You can see, you know, 70 to 80% of the supply chain emissions are your total organizational supply chain carbon cost. That's why we're focusing here and right up front in the very first session. Okay, go ahead, Dan.
All right. Well, I mentioned data was really at the heart of tracking and reporting in the supply chain. So whether it be your ERP, your supply chain systems that you have, or those of your suppliers and vendors and your customers, right? It's bringing together all of the data through the various aspects in order to track and measure your carbon footprint. And organizations now are being increasingly asked to do that, both from a government standpoint, but also by their suppliers and customers in order to win business overall. So these are the different levers of scope that are really important to tracking a carbon footprint, and how these standards are being developed for sustainability goals in order to report and measure the different impacts of your operations and your supply chain on the overall ecosystem. So scope one, you know, those are your direct footprint, your direct emissions from your facilities, your vehicles, and those are relatively easy to track and report on. But as you move into scope 2 and scope 3, which are indirect, those of your suppliers, those of the downstream supply chain to distribute your products to customers, it becomes increasingly difficult to get to the data to measure and report on the different impacts of your supply chain from upstream and downstream activities to your overall footprint. So our approach, looks at all these different 3 scope areas, and you'll find that these are being standardized in order to track and measure your carbon footprint and the impact that you have to greenhouse gases in the environment throughout your organization, but also leveraging the impacts of those from your supplier and distribution network as well. So our approach to doing this is pretty methodical in order to define a roadmap and help you in your journey. So we work with companies in helping them to define their carbon neutrality plan and roadmap by really understanding the footprint of the supply chain operations and the overall strategy for sustainability of your organization. When are your carbon neutrality goals for? And then working with you to develop a roadmap a phased approach to start on that journey together, and then work on the different baseline and data impacts of how we will track and measure the carbon footprint and our improvements that we're making, and come up with the game plan for a long-term plan to both meet any compliance requirements and meet your own sustainability goals to help throughout the operations. Now, data is at the core of this, right? So we are pulling both from internal systems, such as your ERP and your supply chain systems, but then also external systems of working with your suppliers and your customers to really understand the overall environmental impacts. And there's a lot of new solutions and technologies that are out there in the marketplace that will help you to deliver, to track and measure the data that's required to deliver the insights and reporting to help enable that, and to visualize that your environmental impacts in a real-time basis. So we are working with the leading technology solutions out there in helping to enable this for companies large and small, and really using some of the standardized capabilities that exist out there to leverage your systems and connect to others through APIs, and working with your collaborating with your suppliers and your customers to have a full life cycle visibility into the environmental impacts, and be able to track and report that, again, both for compliance purposes and also to meet your own sustainability goals and how you communicate to your customers and what you're doing to achieve carbon neutrality long term. We have packaged up a couple different offerings in order to help you get started and really meet you wherever you are on your journey. So whether you are perhaps a supplier to a big box retail customer like Walmart or Target, and have some specific requirements to meet their supplier compliance needs, or whether you are working to develop a long-term plan for sustainability internally and to meet governmental and tax requirements for the future. We have different kind of package solutions where we can come in and help define that plan and execute to provide you guys with the data and the road mapping required to meet your future goals. All right, Jason.
Okay, so now we have to make a business decision. And as we all know, the CFO is going to have the model to make sure that it makes sense for the business. Go ahead, Dan. Let's break apart the problem into a few different pieces. So we've already talked about the lower costs of onshoring, nearshoring. And some of the onshoring has lower costs even within the US because of the tax incentives, which is the purpose of the conference. But secondly, we would want to understand the working capital unlock, inventory being unleashed. And then lastly, we want to make sure we have a really nice ESG story for our board of directors and perhaps the capital markets. But the point of this is we're trying to help save the planet, but we're also trying to increase profitability, which seems like a very difficult goal, but we're here to tell you and show you in a case study that it can be done. Okay, go ahead, Dan. All right. From a modeling perspective, whenever you're meeting with the finance team, there's both income statement benefits here and there's balance sheet benefits. In a moment, the case study we show you is how this can be done to improve sustainability and be more profitable. That's an income statement effect. We're going to increase your after-tax net income while at the same time decreasing your carbon footprint. All right. Point being, though, and I think you know this, the working capital benefits sometimes can be just as powerful as the income statement benefits, and those will affect your balance sheet, i.e., unleashing millions of dollars of cash from inventory that can be used to pay down debt. A big idea. And then Dan's piece was all along the way, we want to understand what's going on with our sustainability goals and the reporting and measure it, and we can report on that along the way. Okay, so let's dig in a little bit here. All right, so we're going to set up a case study. You know, if you do some research on the average US manufacturer and you just want to understand how much electricity that average manufacturer is using, okay, an average bill of about $6 million is about right. Okay, what does that translate into? Well, that means they're probably purchasing about 60 gigawatt hours throughout the entire year. Okay, what that means then is that at any one moment, as they're operating their business, they're probably pulling about 20 megawatts off of the grid and paying for that at market rates. Now, this depends on how many hours you're open and all these sorts of things. So we're just using averages. But the point is, if I really want to be net zero and I want to set up a solar array to take advantage of the far lower solar capex, well, then I need to plan for being able to have an output when the sun is shining of about 20 megawatts. All right. Well, here's part of the big news. That used to cost 60, $80 million. Okay. The price points have come down dramatically. Right now, it's easy to remember about $1 per watt. So in the case of 20 megawatts of power that are needed in the moment, well, $20 million is not a bad rough estimate of how much that's going to take to build that out. Okay, so from a business perspective, now you have a choice. You have a choice of, okay, I'm going to pay $6 million a year for my electricity to the grid, okay, or I'll invest $20 million in a solar array type of setup, okay, and I'll self-power. It'll last for 2-3 decades, and there will be maintenance costs along the way, okay? But here's part of the big news of this conference is that the government legislation and incentives for people to look at this have been transformational for our landscape, and everybody should look at it, all right? So Ron and his team, they're experts at this. What we would do is we would understand that $20 million project between solar and backup battery power, okay? And then between federal and state and local opportunities, understand what kind of incentives and credits we can have on the back end, all right? Bottom line, you know, we're gonna aim for about half of that CapEx cost back in year one credits, and then you're gonna get depreciation and energy savings in the out years. So you get the full impact there. So Ron's going to walk you through some of the details here, and it's fairly transformational. Go ahead, Ron.
Thank you, Jason. So as Jason had commented, this is the Tax Credits and Incentives Advisory Conference. The items that we talk about are what we would say across all industries are applicable. So what Jason was referring to and what we'll be spending in the next session approximately an hour and a half on is the Inflation Reduction Act of 2022. Actually, from an anniversary, it's 1 year anniversary tomorrow, as it was signed by the president on August 16th. So what we wanted to do in the sustainability and supply chain concept was to give you a very simplistic baseline of how a CFO, a CEO can utilize the Inflation Reduction Act to lower cost from an energy perspective, create greater sustainability in their business, but utilize federal and state dollars to do that, because that is, in fact, what was in the Inflation Reduction Act, $750 billion to $1 trillion of credits, incentives, deductions, rebates, and exemptions to ultimately drive the United States to carbon neutrality by the year 2055. So Jason has set us up in a great fashion in regards to a case study. So let's walk through from a tax credit and incentives perspective of how we can use changes in law that affected January 1 of 23. But remember, the concepts that we're talking about have been in the tax law for a long period of time, specifically when we talk about solar credit, which is this simple example. But we do geothermal, hydroelectric, microturbines, really any and all alternative energy systems that a company could be considering to help drive their sustainability and their ESG, and more importantly, lower their cost. So as Jason teed it up, we are going to spend approximately $18 million of real cost attributable to our solar system. We are going to also battery pack or put a storage facility in place that would cost about $2 million. So let's talk about what the tax law allows for us to do this and how it incents us. So a solar credit traditionally was phasing down, but underneath the Inflation Reduction Act, it is now 30%. So it's moved from 26 to 30. And then there are also bonus credits that we'll talk about in the next session. But for this simple example, if I put a $20 million system in place, I'm going to be looking at $5.4 million of federal credit attributable to the $18 million. When I connect, as it's referred to, the solar system and begin to generate those kilowatt hours. The battery pack, which was a change, also we can take a 30% credit in regards to us storing our kilowatt hours and thereby using behind the meter, as it's referred to, those kilowatt hours in our facility. That facility could be manufacturing, it could be a pharmaceutical company, it can be a commercial building, etc. So again, it's really across all industries that these opportunities exist. And then the federal bonus, as I mentioned, has bonus credits. So when we think about supply chain and the onshoring, as well as reshoring or nearshoring, there are bonus credits that are available. So in this example, we have indicated that based upon our site selection, we fall into what is referred to as an energy community. And we receive an additional 10% credit above and beyond the base of 30%, a la the bonus credits. So that earns us another $1.8 million attributable to our investment. So our total federal credits sum to $7.8 million attributable to our investment as a company. That is a dollar for dollar offset against our federal tax liability. Change in law can carry that back and forward, back 3, forward 22 years. So there's opportunities there from a tax planning perspective. But upon the interconnection or the connection of our solar system or array, in regards to our facility, we earn $7.8 million of federal credit to be utilized against our tax capacity. But it gets better. States have also adopted and state statutory adopted credits. So this facility we selected was in South Carolina. We receive 25% South Carolina credit, but it is limited to $2.5 million in South Carolina. All states are moving in the direction of the state statutory adopted credits, whether we're talking about solar, geothermal, hydroelectric, or other credits that we'll talk about in detail in our next session. So the takeaway here on the energy investment credit benefit should be that we're spending $20 million as a company, a taxpayer, and we are rewarded in doing so to the amount of $10.3 million between federal and states credits. And again, there will be direct pay or transferability provisions, which we'll talk about in the next section, attributable to if we can't utilize that quote credit in its entirety, then we may be able to sell that credit with no income tax consequences. So it gets better than that. So now we look at, well, I've spent $20 million on my asset, my solar array system, my battery pack. So my total system basis is at a cost of $20 million. Now, by tax law, we have to reduce our quote depreciable basis by 1/2 of the federal ITC credit, which is on the left. So we're reducing that by $3.9 million. That's attributable to, of course, the 7.8. And then we have a new basis in our energy system to which we can apply rules around bonus depreciation. So we are now at an 80%. So because our class life of our solar system, not unlike other alternative energy systems, is below 20 years, we are eligible for bonus depreciation. So we get to, for tax purposes, immediately expense in the year in which we connect the solar system and ultimately into or turn it on as the connection, interconnections into the grid. We get to deduct $12.9 million. We further, because in this case, it's a 5-year asset, we depreciate under makers the balance, which would be about $640,000 in 2023, attributable to the cost associated with $16.1 million. So out of $16.1 million of cost, we are depreciating or expensing $13.5 million. Note, there's also state opportunities here. But at the end of the day, using a flow-through rate of 45%, that is an additional tax savings to us for having and incented us to create alternative energy in our sustainability plans and our ESG plans of an additional $6.1 million. So the combination of those two is $10.3 million and $6.1 million. So we spend $20 million and we receive, in the year in which we connect or interconnect, $16.4 million of tax benefit attributable to the Inflation Reduction Act and some of the incentives, credits, deductions, rebates. Next slide, please. But it ultimately gets better, because when you think about ongoing annual savings and you put your hat on as a CEO and a CFO, there's really two types of ongoing savings: the solar energy arbitrage, as we refer to it, and the battery storage peak arbitrage. So what does that mean? So this graph is a battery storage peak shaving concept. So what we're doing is, as we said, we have a battery pack. We are storing kilowatt hours or gigawatts in our battery pack. And during peak periods, we are utilizing our stored kilowatts, gigawatts to create lower energy costs above and beyond what we've identified in the prior slide. So peak utility prices, when you think about peak periods of time, think about from 6 a.m. to literally about 6 p.m. each night, the heavy load on the grid through the country. If you are a manufacturer or a commercial real estate, you know that those peak periods are obviously when the factory is running or people are in the building, mechanicals are working, etc. So there's a draw on energy. That cost is on average 25 cents per kilowatt. However, we've been able to utilize our battery pack to create a lower spending through the battery use. So the savings ultimately that we calculate here on 6 gigawatts at an average of 10 cents on the utility side, that's $6 million. Conservatively, we put in there 2 cents per kilowatt hour on the maintenance of our system, the maintenance of the solar array system. And that is going to be an average cost of about $1.2 million. So beyond the federal credit, beyond the depreciation tax benefits that we identified, we have an arbitrage in savings by utilizing solar and the battery versus the grid of an additional 4.8 million. And that's on a per year basis. So a tremendous incentive for us to, one, create our sustainability plan, think about our supply chain and how we can use these incentives and credits from the federal and state governments to ultimately pay or help in that sustainability strategy for the company. Next slide. So we're estimating here just the lifetime battery peak and the shaving value. So the battery storage now is turned on during the peak utility pricing hours to avoid that high price energy. We kind of walked you through that. But ultimately, as you see here, that creates another $2 million or 1.8 in the arbitrage, if you will, on energy savings, which is cumulative, which is on top of the ITC credits and the depreciation benefits of the battery pack. And this is a real operational benefit of a source of power when also the grid could be down, as we recently saw nationally, or the purchase of those become too expensive. So again, the battery storage coupled with renewables footprints ultimately helps drive that sustainability strategy we have, and by using federal and state dollars. Next slide. So to summarize, the full ORI model puts it all together for you. And we model all of this for you at Cherry Bekaert when we are assisting you in your supply chain, and we're assisting you in determinations around alternative energy systems and the federal and state credits and incentives that are available to you underneath the Inflation Reduction Act, or could have been available to you prior to the act. So again, $20 million capital investment yields to 10.3 million in credits upon the grid connection. In year one, we're allowed 13.5 million accelerated depreciation, which is worth another 6.1 million, quote, in reducing our tax liability. We have the raw energy savings that we walked you through at about $4.8 million. And then I went through it a little quickly around the battery peak shaving benefits, but that's another $2 million in lifetime energy savings. So Jason, you want to kind of drive this point home as a former CFO and CEO of a publicly held company?
Sure, Ron, nice job. So guys, recently I was the CFO and later the CEO of Skull Candy, the headphone maker based in Park City, Utah. And we were under tremendous pressure by our big retailers to come up with a carbon neutral plan that was real, not just hypothetical, but fact-based. And so we struggled with that. It's hard work. The reason why we're doing this to kick off this conference, this is an attention getter. The case study that we just walked you through, it's happening every day. Ron and his team are helping many clients garner tens and hundreds of millions of dollars of tax credits over the next few years. And from an industry leader perspective, myself, it's an immense source of pride when we can point at customers that are both helping to save the planet and get carbon neutral with renewable energy, but at the same time, it's helping the enterprise by creating profits, not becoming a drag. You can do both. So this is a game changer. And guys, as you lean in over the next couple of days, there are other bonus tiers that we have not even included here. And Ron and his team are going to walk you through that. The easiest one to remember is domestic content is another 10% bonus if you can be sure that most of the content, the raw materials of what you're building with, it's made in America. Okay, there's challenges there, but there's other bonus tiers available. So it can be done. Thank you, Ron.
So next slide. So it gets better. So we'll talk in great detail in our next session, but underneath the Inflation Reduction Act, there are numerous programs to continue to incent above the credit, and the simple example we just went through, but to incent taxpayers and ultimately fund taxpayers. So we work with the Department of Energy, or what's called the Loan Program Office. There's two pillars to the Loan Program Office. There are loans, which are at very favorable rates to the extent that you want to finance the project, in our example, the $20 million. Or there are grants that can be applicable to you. So there's $350 billion that was appropriated to the Department of Energy's Loan Program and Grant Office. There are $40 billion that have been allocated attributable to what is referred to as innovative clean energy loan guarantees, where a taxpayer may apply for the loan and or grant, and we walk you through that process, interface with the Department of Energy, and ultimately write the grant or the loan application for you. But there's $40 billion attributable to innovative clean energy. There is another $250 billion that was allocated around energy infrastructure and what's called the reinvestment program, and another $40 billion around advanced technology vehicle manufacturing. Obviously, everyone is very familiar with Tesla. And so when you think about the other type of manufacturers that we see that are now onshoring in the United States, I'm in Raleigh, North Carolina. We have a auto manufacturer that is building an electric vehicle plant of $5 billion, and it's all electric vehicles called VinFast. And then ultimately, to reward very specific areas of the country, there is what's called the Total or Tribal Energy Loan Guarantee Program of $20 billion, to the extent that a alternative energy system is being constructed on tribal energy land and or Alaska Native land. So there's $350 billion just set aside and allocated to taxpayers to assist them with respect to not only their sustainability, their ESG, and ultimately their alternative energy or green energy considerations. Applications, as I point out here, did open in February of 23. And I'm pleased to say we are already assisting a number of clients attributable to the Department of Energy loan program. So at this juncture, I want to make sure I turn it back to Jason. Jason?
Go ahead, Dan. All right. So on site selection services, I mentioned those earlier. The bottom line is that as your COO and your supply chain experts are trying to figure out where they're going to take the manufacturing, okay, many clients are looking at Mexico, and I'll show you some numbers there in a moment. But within the United States, many states are stepping up and offering all sorts of incentives and grants, okay? We have a site selection team that can help you think through the pros and cons of different states and then help you interface with their offices. It's a wonderful service, and it's part of this process, okay? And then in the appendix, go ahead, Dan, let's show you some facts. And all of these recordings are available for you all, so you don't have to scramble to take notes here. So let's just take it US labor rates versus Mexican labor rates. This is why Mexican has become so attractive with the re-up of the free trade agreements that were passed 2 years ago. All right. Number one, it's a free trade zone for us. But number two, for average laborers, and you can see different types here, the per hour cost is about 10 to 20% of America. Now, there are challenges with figuring out what capabilities can be done in what regions in Mexico, and that takes a lot of research. But this is the key driver here. If you can manufacture in Mexico, you can load a truck and you can have those at the distribution center for Walmart in 2-3 days. Whereas if that's taking place in Asia, as we all know, that could become 3-4 months. Huge difference, okay? And then secondly, a lot of people, go ahead, Dan, a lot of folks might wonder, well, is Mexico really cheaper than China? And the short answer is absolutely yes. The crossover was in 2009, when on an hourly basis, Mexico was about as expensive to manufacture from a labor perspective as China. But what's happened is China became more and more expensive as more and more manufacturing has moved there. They absolutely have a technology advantage in China, which is one of the complexities that have to be thought through. Whereas in Mexico, things have been fairly stable. Now, recently, in the past couple years, Mexico has ticked up slightly because they have increased their technology advantage, which is a good thing, not a bad thing. But the point of the slide is there's a cost arbitrage here in Mexico, not just versus the US, but also versus China. Okay. So this is why we kicked off the conference in this way. This is an attention getter. We can make this profitable for the CFO while at the same time having a best-in-class net zero story. So the last polling question, poll 4 here, it's fairly straightforward, which is, as you are thinking through these things in your company, not just from a tax perspective, but from a supply chain, manufacturing, digital and net zero perspective, i.e. renewables. Is that something that you could use help with? Yes or no? And thank you everybody for participating. All right, that shouldn't have taken too long, so we'll kind of wrap it up here, but just Cherry Bekaert wants to really thank all of you for showing up. We had a big audience here and we're very happy about that because this was meant to get you a little bit excited. It can be done both from a financial perspective and a net zero perspective. Go ahead, Ron.
So that concludes our first session. We always want to underpromise and overdeliver as one of our core values. So we're about 158. So thank you again for joining us. If you have any additional questions regarding today's topic, please feel free to reach out to Jason, Dan, or myself. Our contact information is here. And again, we thank you very much for attending today. We also value your feedback, and we would ask you to take part in a short survey that will be sent out after this session. Our next webinar, Understanding the Inflation Reduction Act and Other Energy Incentives, will begin in about an hour at 3 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. So we hope to see you there. Thank you and have a great day.